My husband brings a pregnant Meryl Cleet home and lies to me, claiming that she's his stepmother. I'm wholly against the idea, but she says, the children will call you their mother when they're born, so you don't have to go through the pain of childbirth. Think about how lucky you are, experiencing motherhood without the suffering. I demand a divorce in the heat of the moment. Meryl is so infuriated by this that she faces labor complications and later dies. Out of guilt, I become a stay-at-home mother to care for her two super male kids. Yet they scald me with boiling water and blind me in one eye. My health deteriorates under their intense torment, and I'm diagnosed with uremia. That's when I accidentally discover Meryl isn't my stepmother, she's my husband's mistress. I'm in despair when I return home. To make matters worse, I catch her, when she's supposed to be dead, and my husband in bed together. Her two super male sons ultimately stab me to death. When I open my eyes again, I'm taken back to the day she fakes her death. Julie. You killed my mother. My husband, Gary Cleet, yelled at me angrily through the phone. Come here now and bring enough cash with you. You're going to be the kid's mother now. Gary's anxious voice ringing in my ears suddenly drew me back to the present. After recollecting my bearings for a couple of seconds, I finally understood the situation. I had been reborn and given a second chance at life. Also, what did he mean by his mother? That woman was very obviously his side chick. She was a cougar. But because he wanted to go out in public with her, he lied to me, saying she was my mother-in-law, and even made me wait on her hand and foot. I angrily hummed in response to Gary's yelling. As soon as I hung up, I hurried to the hospital as quickly as possible. After getting the cab driver to switch lanes and use a different route, I realized I was shaking uncontrollably in the car. In my past life, after Meryl Cleet, my fake mother-in-law, was found to be pregnant with two super male twins. I had been openly opposing the pregnancy. It would be an advanced maternal age pregnancy to begin with, and their father was also found to be an unknown super male as well. Meryl had agreed to undergo an abortion at first. However, she and Gary went behind my back and even started caring for the pregnancy in my marital home. When I found out about it one day, I told Gary that I wanted a divorce, but Meryl had been so triggered that it induced early labor, and she died from the complications. Meanwhile, because I'd gotten into an accident on the way to the hospital, her body had been cremated by the time I made it to the place. I had felt so guilty and remorseful that I got gaslit into taking care of the super male twins by Gary. However, I was constantly and continually abused by both of the kids. By the time I turned 30 years old, my body was racked with a lot of pain, injury, and illnesses. In the meantime, Meryl, who was supposed to have died, came back to life and started behaving like a carefree and lovesick woman with Gary. Her favorite pastime was burying herself in Gary's arms while telling him tall tales about me. Honey, Julie just yelled at me again. I'm scared. Under Gary's instructions, I was then murdered, dismembered, and buried into the wall by my two super sons. However, they had been released without bail or prosecution because they had been underage when they committed the crime. I arrived at the hospital an hour earlier. As I thought about what happened in my past life, I inhaled deeply to calm my nerves before rushing into the ward. Meryl's body was covered with a white cloth. Gary was standing on one end of the bed, looking upset and forlorn, but there wasn't a single tear on his face. Meryl! I screamed, letting the eye drops I'd just put in my eyes stream down my face to look like I was crying. Meryl! How could you do this to us? How could you just abandon your 3 sons like this? How could you leave them behind? I kneeled by the bed and continued to wail. The nurses and doctors watching all looked touched. Gary shoved me angrily and said, if you hadn't provoked Mom, she wouldn't have died from early labor complications in the first place. It's now all your fault that the boys were born motherless. You're going to be their mother now. That's the only way you can make it up to her. Hearing this, I slapped him hard on the face. I had to get my say in first. How dare you accuse me like this? It was your fault. I told you that Meryl had to move around and exercise while she was pregnant because it would reduce the complications during birth, but what did you do? You carried her everywhere she wanted to go. You wouldn't even let her take off her pants by herself and insisted on doing it for her. You were the one who caused her death. I then pinched my arm hard and forced myself to cry. Everyone turned to look at Gary with judgmental eyes when they heard what I said. Gary seemed not to know what to do. I covered my face and pretended to be racked with sobs. Then, while everyone's attention was away from me, I yanked off the white cloth covering Meryl's body. Gary saw what I did and rushed up to stop me. Don't, however, he was too late. I had completely uncovered the cloth from the body. I looked at the body on the bed and exclaimed in shock, that's not Meryl. I took 2 steps backward and started screaming at the doctors and nurses. What is wrong with the hospital? This is not my mother-in-law. My voice successfully attracted the attention of the other patients visiting family members. One of them was even a well-known online personality, Paul Brogan. And just like in the past life, he immediately whipped out his phone and started live-streaming everything to his platforms as soon as he smelled the drama about to happen. Gary looked at a loss for what to do. He tugged at my arm and said, can you please stop making a fuss? We can always go back and discuss things. I shook him off and started interrogating the doctors and nurses at the scene. How do you even do your jobs? You had literally one job and you lost Meryl. Where is she? I heard that hospitals often worked with black markets to sell off their organs. You sold my mother-in-law's organs to the black market, didn't you? Poor Meryl. Poor Meryl indeed, I cried hysterically. The doctors and nurses exchanged glances and immediately denied it. No, it wasn't us. Your husband was the one who started to wail as soon as he saw the body. We naturally thought you were the deceased's family members. I turned and glared at Gary at once. More and more people were gathering outside the hospital ward, and Gary was starting to break out in a cold sweat. He hurriedly explained, maybe Mom's body has already been sent to the morgue. I must have made a mistake in my haste. I knew that this was just his excuse. I knew I had arrived earlier than expected, so they didn't have enough time to deal with it. I slapped Gary in the face and said, what do you mean you made a mistake? It's the hospital's fault. I must call the police. Then, I took out my phone, which I'd already pre-entered 911 beforehand, and immediately called the police. At this point, Gary was thoroughly panicking. He tried to snatch my phone out of my hands and said, dear, calm down. The hospital can't possibly have done such a thing. I neatly avoided his hand. It was then that the other end of the line picked up. Hello? I want to make a report. I highly suspect that Thornhart Hospital's obstetrics and gynecology department is working with organ smugglers to sell off their patients' organs. They sold my mother-in-law. I spoke very quickly, not giving a chance for Gary to interrupt me. He was so anxious that he scratched his head and kicked me hard. I narrowly missed it but still fell to the ground in a huge show and started to scream, Gary Cleet. Even though Meryl wasn't your biological mother and even though she never registered her marriage with your father, you still can't conspire with the hospital to sell her off like this. Everyone's faces changed when they heard what I said. I'd managed to pay a few people to act as my enablers at the hospital while I was on the way in the cab. He cried, no wonder that man didn't even cry or get anxious about her. It was his stepmother. After all, no, it's not even his stepmother if the marriage wasn't registered. Even though you're not related to her, you still couldn't be such a terrible person to sell off her organs. It's illegal. That's funny. If the deceased wasn't his mother or stepmother, then what kind of relationship did they have? The wife seemed to imply that they're somehow involved with each other. Gary had to speak up since the public seemed to be putting pressure on him. He said, don't speak nonsense. She didn't marry my father, but I still treated her like my own mother. So did you also help your biological mother take off her pants when she went to the toilet? Another one of my enablers shouted. I bet she was a cougar preying on you instead. I was very impressed. Gary flew into a rage. But he didn't dare to strike me, so he took a few steps backward and glared at me silently. Then, he ducked behind a nurse and started texting someone on his phone. I immediately jumped up from the floor and snatched the phone away from him. Then, I pointed at his screen and shrieked, you still say that you didn't know anything about this. The chat window that was open showed his last message, which read, things have gone wrong. Come here quickly.